exhibits do y'all have going on right now?
Right now we have, for Black History Month, we have John Sandridge. Are you guys from Gadsden?
John Sandridge
Yeah.
came and he did a pastel of me in elementary school.
Really? Did we talk on the phone?
No.
Okay. Sorry. So somebody called me and said something similar.
He came. I went to Thompson Elementary School in North Gadsden when I was a kid in elementary school, and he came into our art class.
Really?
And while I was doing my whatever we were doing that day, I don't even remember, but he sat beside me and did a profile of me.
And that's incredible.
And that hung over my bed for from like 4th grade on.
At the opening, it was incredible because we had just tons of people with similar stories. It was just great. I mean, like just how he affected their lives.
So his exhibit is there now.
Yeah, it's on the 2nd floor, and then we have this amazing artist from North Carolina who, basically, her statement is about, we're stockpiling all these photos, and we're taking all the time, but like, where does the photo go when you're gone? And so she's just been going to like thrift stores and antique stores and just like collecting all these other people's photos, and she's trying to like give them a second life by making them into artwork. It's really interesting. And then Tuskegee Airmen, and we have this painter from Birmingham, Andy Jordan, who's incredible. Like, it's really good. Like if you don't like, for people that don't like contemporary, I booked it just kind of to show them what exactly abstract is.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of taking nature and just showing like it's basically he paints landscape. Excuse me. He paints landscapes, but then he scrapes it all off, and it's just a color field. And so like it looks like abstractions, but it's really just the landscape and the natural colors coming through. So it's really quite beautiful.
Wow.
But yeah, that's what's up now. The next group of shows are pretty incredible too.
So has John Sandridge, has he passed away?
No, he's still here.
Okay.
Yeah, he's still around.
Okay.
He's just as eccentric as ever.
Really?
Yeah, he's Papa Cause. If you see that sign anywhere, like at any event, if you see a Santa Claus wearing purple, that's him.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I don't remember. I mean, I was in like 4th grade, so I don't. I have a vague memory of him and what he looked like back then. But
the reason I asked if you guys were from Gadsden is he had murals all over the city. There used to be a Sonic over here.
Yeah.
From,
did he do that?
Yeah, he did that. He did the cars that were on Ed's Farm Car Parts. But those are, I grew up looking at those. I was like, those are incredible.
Yeah.
It was him.
So did you grow up here?
Yeah, I grew up here.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
Oaks Bluff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
It's really funny. That's kind of what I'm going to talk about, so I kind of save that for. Are we starting, or is this?
Whenever you get ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay.
And we'll keep it like this.
Yeah,
I'd rather keep it.
You want to sit in that chair? So you can sit up a little bit higher?
Do you want me to sit up for the camera?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to sit top of your head.
Okay, so what I kind of want to talk about is the importance of art in schools and education, and also I'm going to give you a little just generalizations about art history to understand, you know, why contemporary is important is related to early history. Stop me at any point, and then I'm going to take questions from you guys. And she gave me that form, this review, and I'll kind of go over what that means and what you're talking about to your children. So, art started, the definition of art when you start art, you know, history 101, is it starts with cave paintings and little toys, you know, of primitive gods, things like that. That's where art history picks up. And so art history is all about documentation. It's all about, you know, like the great hunt that day, or, you know, who they're celebrating, just telling stories. And so art even the weirdest, most abstract art can be broken down in two ways. It's form and function. So when you approach an art show and you look at it, there's form and function. So that needs to be your immediate. Like, can I use this? Is this a table? Is this a handcrafted wood table? Or is this just, you know, a ball of string that the artist wants to make a statement about? So when it progresses and you get to the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks, the Egyptians were basically telling their language, and they were a little bit of decoration, but most of it was all for a purpose. And the same thing, and then the Greeks kind of kept going. And then with Constantine, you have the Bible. And so that's what was the game changer, because most of everything from that point, like if there was a portrait made of somebody who was either a god or a king, it wasn't just an average everyday person. There's very rarely will you ever find a painting of just an everyday person in Greek or Roman life. There's, only 3 historians that wrote about, that we pull our information from Greek and Roman, and the rest of it all comes from what we learned from art history. So that brings us to the Renaissance. And the Mona Lisa, everybody that comes in the museum, they reference that painting because that's what, but they don't really understand the importance of it. The Mona Lisa was the first one that documented, like a large artist that's doing all this incredible stuff, working with popes and kings and everything, is painting a picture of an average everyday woman. And that was huge, because at that point you're only painting Christ and kings. So that was the kind of start of art moving to this, moving away from documentation with early printing presses and writing, printmaking things where you can actually like replicate everything. So art's purpose is kind of dying out, so it needs a new form to go to. There were several artists before, like Monet or any of the Impressionists, that kind of started that. And it started primarily in France and Europe, and it was the artist named Gustave Courbet. And he basically just started painting all these weird pictures of everyday people. There was a painting called The Meeting. It was just 2 guys meeting on the street. And if you read about it, like he was blamed for causing riots, he was blamed for shutting all these things down and causing anarchy, but it was just a simple painting of 2 guys meeting, and then he did landscapes. Now when he got further along in his career, he did paint things that would, aggravate everybody. But I'm telling you this because that's the point where art became what it is today. So it became a means of expression. And why is it important to keep teaching our children to go into this medium if it does not for documentation? So right around the turn of the century, you start finding out like modern color theory, like when I see the color yellow, what does it make me feel? It makes me feel happy. The color blue makes me feel this. So all that stuff starts coming into effect. And so you start teaching your children that, and then you start getting these great effects of they can communicate better, they can learn better, but why can you do that with art? If everybody here took that SAT, ACT, or college prep or something like that, if you guys remember, most of that was just weird patterns and, even math and the graphing things. It was all kind of problem solving. But that's basically why teachers and intellectuals think it's important, is because you're looking for patterns. But if you're at a young age and you're learning how to create those patterns and seeing like repetition of colors and shapes, it helps you problem solve later in life. And then the cognitive stuff is also, it helps you get in tune with your emotion. And the biggest reason is not everybody is good at something. Everybody in the world can draw. They're not good. And if they can draw good, it doesn't mean it's art. And that's some of the stuff that's in the review too. Everybody wants to kind of argue and say like what art is, but there's a clear definition. So if your kid draws, it's family vacation, stick figures, sunny sky, things like that, that's not art. That's just like an expression. But when you get older and he's trying to tell you a story of how he feels, that's kind of getting into what art is. And so I'm speaking with myself on this. Like I was terrible at any instrument I've tried. I was not good at sports. I didn't really have a place. And so when I was 12 years old, my grandmother put me in a art class. And that's when everything started clicking. And Hope's Bluff, as you guys know, probably didn't. They had like one lady that would come once a week on like during your lunch period, and like nobody wanted to give up their lunch period to take art. So it was one of these things where like I couldn't communicate. I was very introverted and I was very strange. When I could communicate, it was very weird. you know, just like weird stories or something about superheroes or something. But when I started taking art, and I realized that I could kind of talk differently, that's when it kind of locked in. And you guys may find this hard to believe, those 88 students in my graduating class at Hoax Bluff High School with, you know, little to no art programming whatsoever, and out of 88 students, there are now 16 to 17 students working in various forms of art. There's a recording artist, there's several graphic designers, there's me that runs a museum, there's all kinds of things like that, and they kind of found it on their own. So that's, it's weird that they found it, but I'm trying not to get on a tangent. But one reason that people, every time they come in the museum, for example, they automatically think this uppity, like I don't belong here, and they kind of get awkward and they leave, or you know, go back to the imagination place or something. You know, they just turn around. But one of the reasons, like this is a direct correlation of why it got the uppity name, is they started taking art out of schools. And then if you look at private schools, like private, purely academic, some of the religious, like Episcopal and all these other schools, like they put a concentration on art, especially Dono and Aniston. They have a huge art facility, tons of money to it, and they're cranking out engineers left and right. The reason they're doing that is because it's so important to have kids express, and it also helps some of the people that have ADD, ADHD, it helps them get out that weird energy where they can actually focus on their work. And I say that because I have that. I can't, it's painful for me to sit still. But, so it's in private schools, and it's started getting taken up by upper class and made to that stereotype of like snooty people in glasses standing around talking about, you know, weird abstractions and things like that. And so the important of what I'm trying to do with the museum is to take all that snootiness out. Like, there's simple things that I do at the museum. Like I took out all the fine china at the receptions and made everything plastic. Because on First Friday when we have our openings, when people would come in and see the fine china, they would get immediately intimidated and walk out. But going back to the form and function. So if you don't, art is kind of like any visual media that you, movies, songs, or music videos, anything. It's just like that. You hate this, you like this, you kind of got to find your taste on it. So there's the Kirkland stuff you buy, that's more of a functional art. It's meant to go in your bathroom, it's meant to go here. So there's this weird business and fine line part of it too, where not everything that's a painting is art either. So, am I going too fast? No. Okay, so primarily when you come in the museum and you look at an exhibit, I ask people to look at whether it's useful or not. So that takes out if it's functional. So then you got to understand why it is. And good art isn't, it's not what it is, it's why you did it. So you really look at why the person did their work. And if it's a terrible, like I was driving down the road and I saw a dog and it made me do this, that's not good art, you know. So if you don't really like the art, you can relate to the emotion the person puts into it. So the last show that I had was just documentation of my childhood, and I did a group show with my friend, and so we came up with the idea, and then we went separately and worked on it for a year, and then we just brought our pieces in on the same day, and that was the first time we had seen them. And it was oddly similar. It was really weird. It was both about like our fathers and our upbringing, and we had no communication on what it was. But it was this deeper meaning on why we are the way we are. And so that was the artwork. So when people would come in, they would eat immediately just like, this is too controversial or confrontational, and they would either leave or they would just like, I know this, like I've experienced this before. And so that's kind of, it's really tacky for me to say good art, but that's this art where people can engage, and that's what I think is a successful show. Because I learned early on, I've had 37 solo shows, and when it's a bad show, it's awful. So, basically, do you guys have any questions? Or any comments or anything like that? Okay, so in this thing she's talking about the rules and art and symmetry, things like that. But if you're doing the stuff with your kids, it's really kind of fun because these relate to everything. Art is an industry. When you go to art school, for years, when I told people I was getting my painting degree, people would say, "You're painting houses?" You know, like they thought I was crazy. But just like every field you go into college, there's people that succeed and people that fail. But if you look at art as an industry, it's one of the biggest industries that doesn't get talked about. It's in everything that you see. Everything in here is designed by an artist, graphic designer. Everything you see on your TV, set designers, everything like that. So if your kid comes to you and tells you that they want to be an artist, don't freak out, because there's so many careers. Like, I was lucky to finish school and get a job in my hometown. And I mean, it worked out great for me. I mean, in terms of all my friends are moving to Alaska and everywhere like that. But the one thing about art is you have to move where the work is, just like any kind of industry-based, automotive. You come here, you move, to Birmingham, kind of Lincoln, that area. But let's say, I'm trying to think of an industry that's specific to one area. So one thing that people base the poor artists on is like, as soon as they finish college, they get out of school and they're like, well, what do I do now? And like, you really have to work to become an actual artist. The amount of people I know that just graduated from JSU and are successful artists that are like living in large cities is kind of staggering. There's a lot that come here. The ones that stay here and complain about it, you can kind of start asking questions about like, well, did you try to get a job here? Did you, put your dues in here? But the biggest point about art is you have to be, you as a parent have to be supportive and just kind of find out where your child is coming from when they say they want to be an artist. And one thing that's really big about when somebody says they're going into marketing or something like that, by the time they're out, there's not like one set profession for them to go into. They can go into a multitude of professions. That's the same thing with art. So I got my job got my degree as a painter, but when you get in your upper level, because the whole undergrad and high school thing, I wanted to be a painter and I was going to be either a teacher or a painter. There are so many jobs for painters in this world. It's astounding, but you have to know where to look. And you kind of find that if you go to a good school, they'll kind of place you into a job path. Like, I had a teacher that was very good about it was a ceramics professor, and he was just like, you're terrible at this, but you can do this very well. And he kind of pointed me along. And I'm saying that it's so you can kind of see it as a parent, not as somebody that's an academic. So if you're watching your kids succeed at one thing and kind of fail at the other, you can kind of point them in the direction where they're stronger. And it may not be what they want to do, but they can kind of develop it and learn that it's a skill that they can survive on, and then go into what they want later. That was my personal experience with everything that I've gone through with my job. I know that was a lot too. So anything on that?
Well, you did touch on a subject about being in the art field opens up many industries. It's not just sit down and paint.
Right.
And I read an article the other day, one of our new senators, and I don't remember his name, his wife is a principal, and he said the one thing that they're looking at in education is getting them job ready.
Right.
Career or job ready. By the time they graduate, they should have an idea. But most of the time, what you see in your career conventions is employers coming in looking for XYZ, but not the artist.
Right.
So it seems like that is a niche that really should be filled.
Right. Definitely. And the one thing about art is you all work together. So if you make somebody mad in grad school, I guarantee you're going to see them, or undergrad, you're going to see them in your professional career. Because it's it's dense, but you're working in the same network and you're trying to vie for the same jobs. Like, when I went up for my job, I think I went up to, or two other of my colleagues went into the position with me, and I luckily got it. But the one main skill that I stress to everybody is just don't make enemies. You cannot like somebody, but you got to suck up, be nice, whatever, because you will see them later in life. And And so that's, so I'm lucky because in my position I'm constantly bringing in artists and hiring them and getting them positions. So there's no room for prima donnas like you see on TVs and stereotype, things like that. Those people that you watch in movies where they're just like the snooty art person, those are very rare in our field, and they usually don't get past a certain point. So the first thing an art person looks together is craftsmanship. So on a drawing, and this is kind of what I'll go to here, or to the topics in this review. So something weird, if you're a sculptor or anything like that, you want to have clean lines. I'm trying to, okay, so this right here. So if this right here was tattered on one side because your cat ripped it up or something like that, that would be a craftsmanship issue. If this U was jagged right here and it didn't look like a U, that's a craftsmanship issue. And so that's a big thing when, like, if you're a graphic designer and you're pulling something on the computer and you're trying to draw it out and make it nice in Photoshop, you don't want people to see that it's been photoshopped. So they're looking for cleanliness in your work, a finished piece. Like if it's a painting, you don't want fingertip smudges all in your work. You don't want to be able to see, what type of brush they were using, that kind of stuff. So it's cleanliness. But also, there's a weird thing about, so my job title is curator-director. And so a curator, what I do is I get the show, like I book an artist, for example, the one from Birmingham that I was talking about earlier. He brings in a series of works, and he sits them on the floor as an artist, and we kind of look at them, and I see what works with the body work. Like, this makes sense, but this is a whole row of landscapes, but this picture of a clown nowhere goes out, so I cut that out. And so, painters and artists, you kind of look for cohesion. You want to see a solid body of work. But that's what goes into this. So when you're talking about, like, this, for example, you have a central path in this banner. Like, it's not off to the side, it's not awkward, it's straight in the middle. And it has sort of a symmetry. Now, symmetry is supposed to be perfect on both sides. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in artwork, it just means that it's balanced. So this reads as a sun, but if you just had like, all the sunset was here and you just had blue right here, it would just be awkward. So this is basically a good composition because it's central themed and has a nice color balance to it. And the same thing goes with decorating your living room. If you just have like a weird chair in the center of the room, that's the exact point of what I'm talking about. It doesn't fit, it doesn't work. And so that's what you look at in painting and artwork as well. And so balance. So if someone had just painted this white and painted just random circles or balloons or whatever right here, when people talk about weight or artwork, that's what they're talking about. The painting doesn't make sense, and visually it kind of leans this way. It sits too heavy on this side because of the weight of it. So when I'm judging artwork or I'm doing a critique or anything like that, you want to make sure that this is balanced out to where, you bring a couple of these marbles over here, balloons, whatever, and you balance the piece. And the same thing goes with color. If there's just like a weird blotch right here in a red painting, it doesn't make sense. I know these are weird concepts, but same thing. Like, so this, you can draw a line in the middle, and then you have a balanced piece with your color. But like with abstract painters and artists, all that kind of color-filled stuff, it may look simple and simplistic, but they took hours and hours of their lives to develop these rules. Pollock did the paint splatters where you just kind of splattered. His was just like the point where you started making art just for the chaos of it. So all those little splotches that piled up, he used color theory, but he didn't sit there and make each one of those marks. It was kind of just like really fast, like took a long time to dry. So that kind of color field is just a different ball game. It gets into something else. But like when you see them in person, you'll see that the colors match and there's harmony to it, and that's why they're so popular. And it's just like you remember Prince and David Bowie as like, you know, big pop artists. That's the reason you remember Da Vinci, Warhol, is because they were the trendsetters. So that's the best way to talk to kids about it is, you know, why do I need to know about this person who wore crazy wigs and painted soup cans? It's because they were the ones who changed the market and made it different. So, but all these principles that are in here are just very simple, just dealing with how to make a good piece, like how to overall make a good balanced piece that you would want in your home or you would want to see at a museum, basically.
So is that the foundation for them understanding craftsmanship?
Yes, exactly. And I don't know if I did a good job comparing it, but it's just, you want your child to see an overall bigger picture when they're working on something. Because think about them when they're 2, 3 years old and they're just doodling something. You know, it's just random all over the page, weird proportions, sizes, everything like that. But when they get older, you want them to kind of draw a bigger picture. And so, it's not STEAM, but there's a math program that enters in art, Math Now or something. Do you guys know what that is?
Right Start or?
I can't remember what it's called. But I was reading the philosophy for the last couple of weeks, and basically they're trying to integrate art into math. But the reason they're trying to do that is what I was saying earlier, like in SAT problem solving, they want you to learn that. But basically what you want to teach your kids when you get into that is just repetition, like patterns, how to copy something, how to make it symmetrical. And then, like this, we learn things visually faster than we do verbally because we don't really understand. Like, I could be saying something and using several slang words or things that you don't understand or you just don't really care about, but I can do it visually and you'll understand it immediately. So that's kind of what they're trying to get when they're entering it early on into children's lives. So that's one big point that people kind of always miss is they want to just, you know, go to a sip and strokes and paint like a snowman. You're not really learning anything because you're not learning what color mixing or how to make a thing. You're just learning how to replicate someone else's images. And that's one thing, Pinterest and YouTube and all these things are great resources, but you have to make sure that if you watch a lesson that they're actually learning something and not just replicating somebody else's work. So the best ones, like if you're trying to find like a curriculum or something to give your kids, that there's some point where they're actually learning something. So one thing is just like composition, coloring, how to do perspective where it's going off in the distance. Like you want to make sure they can do that precisely. And not every kid's going to get that. That's one of those like upper level concepts. I mean, my first art teacher had me drawing the cubes forever just to get with it. And one thing too is like the first, second year of college, you just sit and draw boxes and paint boxes for the first 2 years. And you're not painting anything in color, you're just doing boxes. And so it's just to get that simple point across of like, how do I make a composition? You can't just become an artist overnight. There are people that have that ability and they get through the cracks and they somehow become super successful, but that's not really how it works in the everyday real world, you know, practically.
So by doing the boxes in college, was that for replication or was that?
It wasn't for replication because basically in the center of the room there'd be like a still life of boxes and everybody would be at a different perspective. And so you would teach yourself how to do shading from your angle, okay, how to light the boxes, how to stack them to where it made, like, because you just have a stack of boxes. You have to make a composition out of those boxes that actually makes sense. And I know that's, just stack a bunch of books on the table and then try to make a good painting out of that is very difficult because there's nothing to grasp onto. But yeah, that's where it comes into like, beats in your head, like, how do I make this painting interesting with 2 people in it where they're not just like front center profile? Because if you start looking at front center profile pieces, that goes back into documentation and that's more of the function part that I was talking about earlier. Something funny, if you go into a museum and you look at any historical portraits, the South had less, the South didn't have really any kind of big artists in the early part. And so what they would do is they would send people with pre-painted portraits. So it'd be like, you know, the feathered wig, the wig, and then the feathered collars and everything like that. And then they would superimpose like a plantation owner's face in it. So if you go to a museum, and there's several in Atlanta, several images at the High in Atlanta of just like odd faces and like, you know, weird bodies, and that's because they would superimpose the face. That's just a weird fact. So if you're going and looking at, you know, like, why is this so awkward? It's because it's not that person's body. There was Gilbert Stewart who did the portraits of George Washington. He either met Washington once, or was just doing everything from measurements. So it was just this weird thing of him working overseas on these portraits of George Washington, who he's never seen, and that's the most iconic image of Washington that we know. So it's just really strange. So but they would measure his nose, they would do all this stuff, and they would send it back to him, and then he would look at it and say if it was good or bad, whatever. But if you ever skip forward, look that up, Gilbert Stewart. There's more to it. I gave you a lot of generalizations in that. Trying to think. Is there any points that you guys would like to know about that, you always hear something about the art world and just kind of myths I can debunk, or anything specific to your child or your home?
Well, what is your recommendation for getting a child started?
Basically, it's basically like anything. Like, let's just do musical instruments because it's easy. You kind of just throw it at them and see if they take to it. If your kid, that's another thing too, is like you can be into sports and like art. I don't want to build that stereotype of you have to be one way, but like most artists aren't really athletic, or they just think a different way. But you just kind of find just like a one-time art teacher that's, just kind of away from home, or, just like one little art lesson to see if they like it. Like art camps are the best because they get to kind of stay away for, a couple days, and they kind of develop with other people in the room, and that's either kind of a make it or break it kind of thing. They'll either find something that they'll continue or learn and they'll pick up and they'll use the rest of their life, or they'll just like, I hate this, I never want to see a paintbrush again in my life kind of deal. But it's not something that you can force. Like, you can't force your kid to be creative. You can force them to paint things for you, make crafts for you, but you can't force them to, pour out their emotions on the canvas or something like that.
So how many artists can you think of that didn't really know their talent until much later in life?
Oh, Van Gogh is a big thing like that. Like, his brother was an art dealer, and he never sold one painting in his entire life, but yet he continuously painted. He worked at it constantly, and he's one of the biggest things we know. And there's weird things about artists too, is because they were so larger than life. There's all these stories, him cutting off his ear. They often say that he committed suicide, but he died of a gunshot wound to his stomach. And his last series of paintings were birds flying out of a field. So what he was doing is he was shooting a gun to get the birds to go up in the air, and accidentally shot himself. But he didn't commit suicide like everybody thinks. But he was one that didn't know his true potential until he was dead. But there's so many like that the art market caught on so late that they didn't even know if they had any aptitude for it. Because something weird about Van Gogh, if you go into his early works, he was just replicating Dutch masters and just making, several, if you Rembrandts or anything like that, he was basically just copying that for the first part of his life, and then he kind of met Gauguin and other artists that were doing something kind of similar, just weird stuff, and he started that weird kind of thick lines and just building canvases. And something weird too is paints at the time were, the base of them was made out of the same thing that his medicines he was taking. So there's also like a stigma of him eating his paints, but it was because it was the same thing as his medicine, and it would cause hallucination, you say the word. Hallucinations. And so basically all those vibrant colors are often linked to, him eating his pants and kind of loose things. But there's countless stories of artists that, you know, didn't really know. Most of the contemporaries, there was already an art market where like lower class was purchasing as well as, you know, upper class. So they kind of knew they made it. So like when you get into Warhol, he knew he was successful because he was seeing like free market benefits from it, like from the, you know, American system. Frida Kahlo, she knew she was famous at one point. She suffered her entire life, but she was the one that kind of, you know, she got to a point where she made it. You know.
Any interesting facts that you know about Vermeer? That is who I'm teaching the co-op on. This term is Vermeer.
Well, Vermeer is one of those that's kind of like Shakespeare, where there's a lot of truths and a lot of fabrications. So like they want to make it this weird romance kind of thing with him, like, you know, putting all the girl with the pearl earring and thing like that. But I think it was a little bit more boring than that, to be honest.
It seemed to me that it was, he just wanted to paint everyday life.
Yeah.
And somehow he had a draw to that. And I keep wondering if it's because of all the children that he had, the chaos that was in the home.
It was mainly due to what I was saying about the movement in the market. Like, if you guys look up Gustave Courbet, you'll see that he was their timelines didn't meet up, but you can kind of see where the art was moving from documentation of biblical things to that. And so it was kind of, when you look into that, that was just when the market was kind of bubbling, because he was actually a selling artist.
But he only finished about 35 paintings.
Right. And he kept a lot of them kind of secret too.
Yeah, and there was a lot of them that weren't even, they didn't even know it was his until later.
Yeah, that was because he was teaching more than he was keeping. So that's another thing too, is like women couldn't sign their own work. So basically there's a lot of master works, when you go back into history, that were done by women, but they couldn't sign their own work, so they would put like, I think it was Artemista or something like that. But anyway, they would sign like masters' names or whoever their teachers were. So it's just kind of interesting. But yeah, he's one of those weird ones that I think is just kind of more, they want to romanticize him, but it's really, there's not enough documentation of him to
and you know, the documentation that I've seen, that I've gotten some of the information from, is from a documentary that I saw on YouTube. That was from the actual papers in Bethlehem.
Yeah, and have you ever seen him just work in person?
No.
That's incredible. Like,
well, we'll be studying, I think it's like 12 art prints of his.
Gotcha.
But yeah,
that was one of when you move away from boxes, you start master studies, and there's a girl by window with a picture. I can't remember the title, but I had to draw that one.
That's pretty much the name of it. All of his paintings are, the titles are just very basic, and
yeah. So anything else?
Who was the guy's name that you said that was kind of like Vermeer? Spell his name?
Courbet.
Gustave Courbet.
Spell it for me. Courbet.
Corbet. And then Gustave, I'm not going to even attempt.
That's fine.
Especially in front of the camera.
That's fine. Gustave.
G-U-S-T-A.
Courbet. Okay. And what was his timeline? Where was he at?
Pre-turn of the century France. So it was late 1800s, early to late 1300s.
13?
Don't quote me on, or 1800s, sorry.
Okay.
It was 1835 is when I think he was born.
Okay.
And then he was mainly working in 1860.
And you're saying that was about the time that you went from documentation into expression?
Yeah, that was the first time when it was like a conflict with the public. When art viewing public started going into galleries and just like, this makes me mad that there's a landscape. And then you'll see directly after that, especially when English started settling America, you'll see just like a wave of landscapes that are just like sweeping, you know, just everywhere. Don't quote me on those dates, but that's what I'm thinking.
But I mean, that's not 12th or 13th, so that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Courbet is in the rotation on the Ambleside.
Okay.
And be careful with this work, because you will get some shockers in there.
Last term I taught on Monet.
Right.
No, Michelangelo. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Michelangelo. And to get the kids not to giggle, you know, the first, and what I was able to show, you know, some things were hid.
Right.
It was close-ups of maybe like of David's face and like his arm or something, and it was so good. But in the beginning, it was nice to see that in the beginning they started off, the kids would giggle, all ages from kindergarten to 10th, 11th grade. But I was able to stress the beauty, and we learned so much about him and why.
Well, something
and how he was able to get so much detail out of his sculptures. And then, by the end of the term, when you would bring out this beautiful sculpture, and it would have some sort of nudity, they didn't laugh anymore.
Well, that's the thing, like Gadsden, when I started working part-time at the museum, you're kind of desensitized from nudity because you see it constantly, like you're doing nude figure drawing classes, you're doing all these things, so you kind of just get immune to it, just like a doctor. Yeah, exactly. And so there was this cartoonish woman that was like the mother of the world, and she was nude, and I hung it without a second thought because I took it away from the children, so it wasn't like in a plain sight for kids to be. It was kind of hidden behind partition. But there was a woman who just lost her mind, and I just had to remind myself that it's a city museum, and this is, you know, it's open to the public, and that's a big deal. So I mean, it was one of those things where there's an amazing story. Was when I was every art student gets to a point where they're about to move into professional careers, and their upper level classes is called portfolio review, and so. My house was covered, and I lived by myself, and so one room was my studio, and there was just a bunch of landscape boxes like I told you, and then one room was just new drawings of all these people, you know, that you had to rotate and draw, and then in the living room was just pictures of my face everywhere, and so you had to pick the best ones because all they wanted to see is that you grasped your fundamentals. And so my exterminator came in, and he had these, and he sees all these things, and he's just like, what? And he starts to kind of slowly back up, and I had to tell him what it was, and it kind of calmed down. Anything else before? I know that was a sidebar.
That's fine.
Something we are talking about this too is proportions. And Michelangelo's David is a perfect one to teach kids about proportions because it's a beautiful work of art. But then you start noticing like arms that are too long, kind of clunky hands, like big feet, you know, weird proportions of head, and that's something that you really have to start watching if you guys come to the museum and look at John Sandwich's stuff. You can kind of start looking at that kind of thing because he paints his hands on his figures really, really large, and that's one thing that you're kind of looking at a piece and it's like, if you would write it off as bad, you have to look, well, was it intentional that he did it so unproportionally? And then you kind of look at his other work and see that his other work has the same large hands, and then you kind of put it together yourself. So that's another thing you can kind of do to kind of delineate bad work from good work. So if they're doing portraits and things like that, you can kind of look at their whole body of work in the show and just decide, you know, like if this is a bad piece of art, or it wasn't finished, or this person just threw this one in there. Like on some albums, when you listen to an album of any kind of pop artist, there'll be like filler songs. And for painters, that's the same thing too. Like you'll just kind of, well, you know, I really need to make some money selling, so I'm just going to throw this one up here, and then I'll take it back and finish it later. So it's the same kind of concepts that run through any kind of form of entertainment. So, yeah.
They talk about in the article about his 7 laws of creation, John Ruskin's.
Yeah,
is that still true? I mean, is that still something that you hold?
Yeah, they just have different names for them all. And it's basically, if you go to the museum and look at the children's room, I have all these posted, and there's examples. But like some of these are switched out for texture, contrast is still there, but they kind of take the same principles, but they just change out the vocabulary. Because if you Google art radiation, it doesn't really come up with, there's some books about it, but it doesn't really give you a clear definition of what that is. And that's just, you know, I may be wrong on this, but the way I studied it was there's like light balance, like how to judge light from dark. That's also contrast too, but that's basically just doing a color scale of, you know, like blacks to grays to whites, that kind of thing. So those principles are true, but they just have contemporary terms with them now. And you can find them just like fundamentals of art. If you type that into Google, it'll give you the, you know, updated contemporary versions.
Okay.
Yeah, and basically what they did is they took all these art books and they just put them together and made the ones that stick. And so like, when you start kind of bouncing around to different painters, you'll see where, you know, I studied Ruskin, or I studied this person, or I followed this kind of methodology, that kind of thing. And that's just where personal preference to wherever path the artist was on at the time. But yeah, all the generalizations of everything are still used in art classes, so it is something used. Let's see. I think that was all my notes. Any other questions?
Well, I do about the museum.
Okay.
So if I was to get together a field trip, for the co-op,
Mm-hmm.